thank the members for your support and your questions. There were quite a few questions citing specific clauses and subclauses, and fairly technical. I'll try my best to answer them all. But let me start by addressing questions from Ms. Dhanalakshmi and Mr. Madhav Mohan, because I think you asked broader questions and other philosophical questions about governance in the government. Ms. Dhanalakshmi, you are right to say there's a balance between central control and as well as getting our stat boards to have flexibility and autonomy and creativity and innovation. And this is a balance that we have to strike between effective governance, policy consistency on one hand, and operational autonomy on the other hand. And it does encourage innovation and creativity. It is the same when a manager runs a department of a few people. You want to give the staff space to take initiative, run with it, work with different people, but they're still your staff. And you meet them once in a while to give them support and direction. And every year, it is good practice, good HR practice, to also do appraisal and coach them on their development. And when something goes wrong, you still have to answer for the staff as the department head. So the same principles apply to statutory boards. The responsible minister is answerable to Parliament for the performance of the Stat Board. But the powers to give directions to the Stat Board and to approve the appointment of the CE are in line with this accountability to Parliament. But for operational matters, it is better for Stat Boards to have autonomy, tapping on board members. And I agree with Mr. Ramesh Rajaram that board members can do more and more active in helping the governance and running of the Stat Board, and ensuring that the board members are from different backgrounds, experience, and skills that they can bring to the table. And that is the layers that we have to put in place to make sure Stat Boards is run well. And in answering to Mr. Madhav Mohan, this bill is really not in response to any government lapses or incidences or confusion on the part of public servants, or that there are instances where Stat Boards refuse to comply with a government direction. The purpose is twofold. I mentioned some of it in my second reading speech. One, for the lack of a better word, is really neatness, really just neatness. Today we have 60 Stat Boards operating in an increasingly complex and disrupted environment, facing challenges that no single agency can tackle alone. The continued need for Stat Boards to be governed well and work together to provide better public service is all the more pressing. The central agencies therefore did a stock take of all the Stat Board acts, and they found that of the governance provisions that are important for to sustain good governance, not all were uniformly present across all acts. Specifically on the clause to give direction, they are present in all acts, but they are written slightly differently with different conventions. So there are no good reasons why they are different, other than they were written and passed at different times in history. So we centralized them into one central act. It is now clear, transparent, neat, and should we find the need and justification to amend them in future, the amendment will also be transparent and more effective. Where there are substantive changes from today, I have highlighted them in my second reading speech. So other than reasons other than neatness, I've highlighted them. One is that we are making it explicit that part of the work of the CE of a Stat Board is to collaborate with other public agencies. This is new. Not that they are not doing so. They are already doing so, but we are now hard codifying this, and in so doing, make our direction clear. The two is the setting up of a data sharing regime that I spoke about. Mr. Madhav Mohan specifically asked if the term CE is a new one mentioned in the bill. It is not new. It does refer to the CEO and the apex job within the Stat Board. Mr. Ganesh Rajaram asked about the tenure of the CEO and whether posting is too frequent. It is a point that we constantly do have to wrestle with within the public service. It is really not part of this bill, but we do have to balance between someone staying long, having the experience and stability but at the same time they can get entrenched, versus bringing somebody new with innovative new ideas. And we constantly have to juggle both. And what you raise is a pertinent point, and we'll continue to consider this very carefully. And I agree with Mr. Madhav Mohan that the broader point is that our system of governance must be one that allows us to constantly work together, recognize problems, and improve. What we do not want is a culture of witch hunt and blame. It doesn't improve things. Our approach has always been to look honestly at our flaws and focus our attention on improvement. And I think this is the culture we've won. Ms. Cha Yong-yong brought it to an even higher level. Say public service really goes much beyond just running day to day. It is much beyond efficiency, but also about service to people, kindness, and humanity. So likewise, if we want to bring about such a culture, it goes much beyond legislation, but also ensuring that the ethos, the spirit, is in every single public service agency, and that culture and that ethos is upheld. Most important of all, to uphold this are the leaders. Leaders across in various levels of the public service. The type of people we bring in, how we make them work together, learn from each other, and uphold the values. And we'll continue to place great emphasis on this. Let me now move on to a topic which is better coordination across government agencies and sometimes even within the government agency. This is raised by Mr. Zaki Muhammad, Associate Professor Fatima Latif, Dr. Intan, and various examples were given, and I think Ms. Cheryl Chan. I agree it's important to coordinate well amongst government public sector agencies as challenges becomes more complex. This bill actually sends a strong signal on the importance of cross-agencies coordination. For example, the bill clarifies how the minister charged with the responsibility of the public sector can work with the relevant ministers to give directions to state boards relating to central policies. And then second, the chief executive of state boards now, by law, have to cooperate and collaborate with other public sector agencies to deliver public value. As to how to ensure strong coordination between agencies and reduce wastage, I think all agencies simply need to work harder, eyes open, ears up, and be more creative, more innovative, more citizen-centric. And this is a point that Ms. Cheryl Chan and Dr. Intan have both raised. And we have seen many such improvement projects. For example, Master Planning Committee coordinates infrastructure projects. There's a one map platform. I downloaded it, it's very useful. It allows 80 agencies to come together on a single platform to provide authoritative location information and services. We'll welcome more suggestions from members. Some of the examples you mentioned are coordination within the departments, and they simply need to sort it out. And it's really beyond, outside of this bill, and you don't need this bill to have it sorted out. But in my capacity as minister, helping out with the driving of public sector innovation, if you observe any of this, please let me know, and we'll get it done. And I'm most happy to take them up. Let me now move on to various technical clarifications. There's various definition coverage. These are raised by Mr. Louis Ng, Ms. Sylvia Lim, Ms. Cha Yong-yong, Dr. Intan. First, the bill does not prescribe the form of directions. It should not, as acts that are overly prescriptive rapidly gets out of date. Even the purposes for which directions may be given and the subject matter they are to cover, the form of directions will likely be informal instruments. Ms. Sylvia Lim mentioned two types of direction. One, as she correctly said, are really central ministries issues, governance issues concerning HR and finance. These typically come in the form of circulars, and they are signed by the PERMSECs. Second are policy directions. And I would say the bill doesn't prescribe this, but the typical way ministries work, and for many, many years and decades that's how it worked, is that there's brainstorming between political office holders and staff, including stat board staff, because they have to take into account implementation issues. And when it's all discussed, they have certain consensus. Staff papers are put up with all the views and considerations and options and recommendations all incorporated. Many angles are covered. And then it goes to the right forum, could be a minister staff meeting. For bigger issues, might go to the cabinet, then approved by the ministers or the cabinet. And then decisions are then conveyed through notes of meeting, through to the stat boards, and then it's followed up that way. This has been done for years after years. Trust me, nothing, for those coming from private sector, this is quite a big adjustment. In private sector, the documentation is not done so diligently. But trust me, nothing in the civil service is decided through WhatsApp and worse through emoticons. Let me talk about Clause 4. It is merely an extension of the principle in Clause 5. I think a member asked about it. Statutory boards are already complying with the government's central policies today, and Clause 4 gives this legislative backing. Mr. Louis Ng asked about the scope of the bill. Simply put, the bill is written such that the provisions apply by and large to the Singapore Public Service Agency. That's how it's written. And Singapore Public Service Agency is broadly defined, which includes ministries and departments, stat boards, and organs of state. The civil service, SAF, SPF, SCDF, legal service are all part of ministries and departments. So the governance requirements of this bill apply to them. There's lots of referencing and definition in this bill, so a bit confusing to read sometimes. I put on record. The governance requirement of this bill apply to them. Likewise, the protection under Clause 11, which Ms. Sylvia Lim asked, extends to every Singapore Public Service Agency too, so your reading is right. However, for certain clauses, civil service, SAF, SPF, SCDF, legal service are excluded because they are already formally subject to central policy governance requirements that are before this bill. For example, these agencies have to comply with government IMs, instruction manuals. For the appointment of the head of ministries, that is permanent secretaries, the Constitution already provides a framework where appointments are made by the President, acting in accordance with the advice of the Prime Minister from a list of names submitted by the Public Service Commission. Dr. Intan asked about CE removal, and that indeed it is not a small matter. Although the bill doesn't spell out the exact processes, but for a CE, a top apex post of a stat board to be removed, that is a serious matter. And certainly a lot of consultation, even before that, it is for performance-related reason, coaching, counseling, that all has to take place. That is only good HR practice. So be rest assured, even removing a public service officer is a serious matter. What more a CE? Ms. Cha Yong Yong asked a specific question whether PA is to be exempted from Clause 40. I think I heard you ask that. The answer is the notice of amendment. The effect of it will be that PA is not exempted from it. It will apply to the PA. Mr. Faisal Manat asked about financial-related provisions that pertains to MUIS. I think clauses 34 to 41. While MUIS are indeed exempted from these provisions of the bill, they are not exempted from similar financial administrative requirements, because all these requirements are currently already spelled out and covered by MUIS's constituting act, namely AMLA. So the reason really why we put exemptions in this bill is because AMLA is a constituting act, it's already an umbrella act, and so since it's provided there, there's no need to duplicate it in this bill. Now let me move to the topic of Clause 11. Ms. Sylvia Lim, Mr. Chen Shou Mao, Mr. Leon Pereira asked about this. Let me explain how Clause 11 comes about first. Clause 5 standardizes the power of responsible ministers to give directions to their stat board. Then Clause 4 formalizes the requirement for stat boards to comply with central policies. Then Clause 11 of the bill presents safeguards to limit the effect of these ministerial directions. So why is Clause 11 needed now? The legal requirement to abide by ministerial direction is not new at all. It's found in the constituting acts of most of our stat boards. But with this bill, we have separate and centralized legislation to provide for this. So it becomes necessary to have Clause 11 to make it clear that ministerial direction does not trump other provisions in the stat board legislation. In the past, they exist in the same act. Now they exist separately. So Clause 11 is needed to make this clear, that it does not trump the provisions in the Stat Board Act. It's a very logical thing to do for legal officers drafting this bill. There are a few key points to this clause. First, the minister's direction cannot be inconsistent with written law. So, for example, the minister charged with the responsibility for government records and archives, a point that Mr. Chen Shomao asked, can direct stat boards to comply with central policies on the treatment of public records. But these policies must be consistent with the provisions in the NLB Act on the role of the National Archives and the treatment of public records. For example, the minister's direction, the Singapore public sector agencies cannot authorize the destruction of public documents without the authorization of the NLB, much less destroy a particular archive or document. To do so will be inconsistent with the NLB Act. Second, the minister's direction cannot impede or affect the performance of statutorily independent or quasi-judicial functions. Ms. Sylvia Lin asks for further elaboration of this. So a statutorily independent function is a function which is required by law to be performed independently. The obvious example is the exercise of judicial functions by the judiciary, but we also have stat boards like the Civil Aviation Authority of Singapore, the Maritime and Port Authority, or the Infocomms Media Development Authority, IMDA. They are vested with the discretion to issue or revoke a license based on criteria set out in their own legislation. As for a quasi-judicial function, that is a function expected by the law to be discharged, taking into account the facts of the case. And some of our stat boards have those powers. For example, a disciplinary committee constituted under the Estate Agents Act has the power to decide if there is sufficient cause for disciplinary action against an estate agent, I quote, according to the circumstances of the case, unquote. Third area of safeguard, the minister's direction should not be specific to a case. So Clause 11.3b, which prohibits any ministerial direction to secure an employment, a promotion or termination of any particular employee of a Singapore public sector agency. For example, the minister cannot direct the award of a procurement contract to any particular tenderer, because that's specific to a case or a person, or to license a particular applicant, or to employ a particular person. And for that matter, you cannot ask the police to arrest a certain person. And I hope Ms. Sylvia Lim is not suggesting that this is happening. In fact, the Police Force Act makes that quite clear. It is the SPF that has the powers to apprehend offenders. So you look at the SDF fraud case that happened, that I answered earlier. I'm flabbergasted. So I want the culprits to face the full consequences of the law, but I can't ask the police or anybody to arrest them. We report through SSG to the police investigate, and police arrest them. That is the way things have been done and will be done. Having said that, in my years of public service, I have not come across an impasse between ministers and public service servants on this point. If there is, the public servant who feel any pressure from ministers can report to their PERMSEC or to the head of civil service, even PSC, even CPIB if the case warrants it, and I'm sure they know how to follow up. Let me just highlight this a bit. We handle MPS cases as well for ministers. And I would say on a typical month, ministers will have handled hundreds, maybe even thousands, of individual cases coming to us appealing for a license to be given, for employment pass to be given, or whatever the case may be. And the discipline all these years has been, we write them down as appeal cases, send it back to the ministries, the staff still process them based on the grounds, based on the circumstances of the case. We can lay out the facts of the case, but ultimately it has to run through the system to be processed. So Clause 11 merely put long and existing practice into law. But however, let me highlight this. If a minister comes across a case that highlights the deficiency in the system, or someone that should be guilty turns out to be innocent, then there is a flaw in the system or in the law. Then it is incumbent upon ministers to review and improve the system, together with the agencies under his charge. Let me touch on a point that Mr. Faisal Manat specifically raised about what is the definition of being politicized. I think to be politicized, for civil servants to be politicized in the context of this act, means to be specifically put under pressure to decide on a specific case. That is being politicized under this bill. Mr. Faisal Manat then went on to talk about a certain advisor, I assume is a constituency that you know, that certain candidate lost and then continued to operate on the ground. But really this has nothing to do with this bill. If there's any specific issue, complaint you'd like to raise, our deputy chairman of PA, Minister Chan, who is not in the House, but he has mentioned before, the role of an advisor has to be very clear. It's to serve the community, it's to foster cohesion in the community. If they overstep and you have reasons to believe so, then please raise it with him. I'm sure he will look into it. Mr. Leon Pereira, you gave a narrative about civil servants who have aspiration to be ministers, therefore they second-guess the minister to be in their good books, in that process, become partisan, and therefore shouldn't we have a garden leave? I think there is a problem with all this. First, you have made second-guessing. Second-guessing is now a bit of a dirty word, but you think about it, in all our work, we do have to anticipate what are the needs of our customers, what are the needs of the people we work with. It is very reasonable for civil servants not to be sycophantic, but to understand what is the ministerial direction, what is the agenda of this government, how is it shaping out, what are the key priorities, and able to work with the ministers to develop policies in those directions. Do you call that second guessing? I mean, you want to put it in a negative sense, up to you, but I think there is value for public servants to do that, and for that matter, for everyone working to do that. And I think consultants too, in a way, have to anticipate and maybe second guess their customers. And this is what real life is. And whether then become partisan, I hope the member is not suggesting that civil servants are partisan, because the conduct and the ethos of civil servants are articulated clearly in the IM, in the career booklets, in the recruitment booklets, that they cannot be politically pressurized. They have to act neutral and in the interests of the public. And therefore, do you then have garden leave for civil servants who then went on and maybe joined politics? And you draw the analogy with the financial sector. I think the circumstances are totally different. In the case of MAS and the financial sector, MAS is a regulator, whereas the regulatee is a commercial, profit-seeking regulatee. And so to prevent a conflict of interest, you don't want an MAS officer to be offered a job by the regulatee while he's still at the job. And therefore, you have a garden leave so that you minimize the chances of that happening. Garden leave is widely practiced across financial regimes in the world. When we come to civil service and political office holders, neither one is not the regulator of the other, and neither are commercial profit-seeking agencies, entities. And you felt that a garden leave will help the civil servant think more carefully before joining politics. I think anyone, not just civil servant, joining politics today, think very, very deeply and spend a long time deliberating that with their families, with their friends, before they are prepared to come in. It is really a calling, as you will know. Let me now move on to data sharing. Mr. Zaki Mohammed, Mr. Patrick Tay, Mr. Cha Yong Yong asked about data sharing, the scope and the benefits. The Data Sharing Directive seeks to strengthen the rules that enable and govern cross-agency data sharing within the public sector. There are two main areas of improvement. I mentioned this in my second reading speech. First, the bill provides the basis for data to be shared. And there are 7 specific public purposes as stated in the bill. These will translate broadly into 2 kinds of initiatives. One, better delivery of services to the individual. This will inevitably have to involve sharing of identifiable and personal data. For example, Mr. Patrick Tay asked for some examples, improving social assistance programs or removing repeated filing of forms when applying for government programs. I spoke about this during the second reading speech. And where feasible, as Mr. Zaki Mohammed has suggested, specific details need not be shared if they are not needed for the task. So for example, when you apply for financial assistance, the data can be shared between other agencies with the processing officer, and they can come in the form of do they meet or not meet the criteria, and not necessarily tell you how much they earn. That can surely be done, and it would be a good practice. It can also involve not personal data, but information that each agency holds, which when put together offers much better value, such as one map I mentioned earlier. The second benefit for data sharing is better policy analysis, planning, and formulation. This will involve sharing of anonymized, non-identifiable data. For example, when deciding where to build certain facilities, we want to understand the concentration of different segments of Singaporeans. There is no need, no personal details in this instance. So to decide whether to build a senior activity center, for example, the relevant agency only need to know the aggregate number of seniors living in the block or in various precincts. It can also be about correlating data to derive deeper policy insights. There is an immense amount of work we can do here to better understand the relations, say, between family backgrounds, education experiences, careers, employments, health, social security, so that we can formulate better policies to address our challenges. However, to do so, raw data from various agencies need to come to a center where they are matched, anonymized, before released to relevant agencies for analysis. We intend to set up such centers where central oversight would mitigate the risk of failing to anonymize data. Let me talk about a point that Mr. Zaki Mohammed raised about privacy and Big Brother watching. This bill is also in alignment with the PDPA, and public service agencies belong to one government. They need to share data information with one another to best serve the public. This bill will significantly improve the protection and safeguard of such shared data. Beyond the fact that there are now clear bases for data sharing, there are 4 levels of protection. First level, it allows existing data sharing practices to be formalized, such as sharing identifiable information for service delivery and enforcement functions, and using only anonymized information for policy making and planning. Second level, by articulating the responsibility of each party involved in the data sharing, it ensures the same high level of responsibility for data protection is borne by all agencies. So it is now clear that the agency that used the data is responsible for protecting and safeguarding it. We will be able to redress the current misalignment of incentive, where the owner of data is still responsible. The third level is that information that is protected by specific legislation today such as information under the Income Tax Act, the Banking Act, and the Statistics Act, will continue to be protected. 4, criminal offences for 3 data-related offences are also introduced in the bill to ensure individual officers are responsible and accountable for safeguarding information. This includes the unauthorized disclosure and improper use of information, and specifically the unauthorized re-identification of anonymized data. The bill did provide for the flexibility for re-identification of data. That is to deal with contingencies, such as when source agencies' data is corrupted or destroyed. And when that happens, re-identification of anonymized data may be performed in order to continue to deliver services to citizens. The purpose of the bill is not to pave the way for a future where government knows everything about everyone and every misdeed everyone committed is all consolidated. I think there was a question by Mr. Gan Thiam Poh. And if ever there was such an initiative, it has to be explained. Why and for what purpose and for what value. And decision-making, be it for policy, license, or grant application, are all reduced to data processing and AI algorithm. That is not the future we want. In fact, it will be quite a sad state. If that happens, civil servants will all lose their jobs because we only need computers and softwares. So in response to what Mr. Patrick Tay said, yes, there are algorithms in various softwares which will be tested and audited, but when it comes to decision-making, there must be human intervention, supervision, and judgment all the time. Ms. Cha Yong-yong asked for greater clarity on data sharing initiatives. Members, I hope, will feel assured that today there is a high level of transparency and public discourse in policy implementation and public service delivery in Singapore. If there's a new service to be delivered, such as recently we hear HDB has an initiative to halve the processing time for transaction of resale flats, it will be announced. And how it will be done will be explained. And I read the whole explanation in the papers. For more significant initiatives, such as MOH, current initiative to set up a national electronic health record system, other than legislative provision, the ministry, when putting aside legislative powers, whether they can do it or not, they have to do this properly. So a separate consultation is being held. New legislation needs to be debated and enacted in this House to protect the users of this system. This bill is to enable, let me just move on. There's one more question by Mr. Madhav Mohan. Mr. Madhav Mohan also asked when unauthorized data sharing may not be an offense. Yeah. The common law already permits sharing of information between public sector agencies where there is public interest. The bill does not allow the data sharing direction to displace the application of common law, nor does the data sharing directive seek to do this. It will instead be providing the much needed practical guidance and certainty on what circumstances would be considered public interest without being exhaustive. So while the bill criminalizes data sharing other than in accordance to the data sharing direction, Clause 7.2 allow a defense where sharing is authorized or allowed by other law. That other law is a reference to the common law. Example, it can be shared in order to respond, say, to a life and death situation of an individual, or in times of a natural disaster or any kind of disaster where contact tracing is required. Mr. Gan Thiam Poh, Ms. Cheryl Chan asked about data sharing beyond the public service to VWOs, for example. This bill covers only sharing of data within public service. It does not include the sharing of data with parties outside of the public service, such as VWOs, healthcare providers, or private and commercial entities. But that does not mean today we do not share data with parties outside of the public service at all. We do so when there are clear justifications to improve the public service or to improve service to the public. For example, to help a student from a dysfunctional family, MOE has to work hand in hand with VWOs, self-help groups, family service centers, and inevitably personal data has to be shared with all these partners. Or we share aggregate data sets with research institutes to conduct research and analysis for the government. Further, data shared with entities outside of public service and designated for service delivery are bound by confidentiality agreements with contractual terms that prescribes data protection requirements, and these entities are also bound by PDPA and Official Secrets Act. Volunteers are also bound by strict confidentiality agreements and educated on the appropriate use of data. Specifically on the sharing of medical data within the healthcare sector, again, this is beyond the scope of this bill because restructured hospital is not defined as part of public service. But MOH is embarking, I mentioned this earlier, is embarking on the National Electronic Health Records Initiative, consulting the public, tabling a healthcare services bill to enable it to do so, to achieve better health outcomes and yet safeguard the interests of patients. Having said that, it is true that when this bill is passed, the framework that governs the sharing of data within public service will be improved and will be better than that for sharing with entities outside of the public service. In areas such as, specifically in areas such as the responsibility to safeguard and protect data. So the framework will be available and set up for the public service, but it will not be extended to sharing outside of public service. So this is something that we should look at, and we will review and consider if further legislation is required. Mr. Zaki Mohammed asked a question about data accuracy and verification. Accuracy of a citizen's personal data is critical for seamless service delivery. We will assign designated agencies to proactively verify and update specified personal data fields and share that across government so that all agencies' databases are up to date and accurate. The government also relies on citizens to verify their own information. So MyInfo, the platform mentioned earlier, allows citizens to amend certain personal information, and this information will be shared for transactional services that the government provides. This ensures that all agencies are using accurate information on the individual based on this latest update. Mr. Zaki Mohammed, Ms. Cha Yong Yong, Mr. Gan Tian Po also asked about storage and security. The government data is stored in government systems which are protected against breach, and more sensitive information, such as identifiable data, will be held in designated databases with even more limited access and additional protection. There are various measures we have undertaken to protect data. First, controlled access and dissemination. Every civil servant, public officer, can only access data he is allowed to access to. Access rights will continue to be prescribed based on security clearance, and data is only accessed when there is legitimate purpose or need. The government continues to calibrate IT security policies accordingly, such as having proper access control and the role-based access of data based on its classification. Deliberate unauthorized access of information is criminalized under other legislation. It is also likely to lead to improper use or unauthorized disclosures of data, which are new criminal offenses under the Computer Misuse and Cybersecurity Act. Existing measures to ensure that public servants do not use privileged access to information and data for their personal gain will continue to apply. For example, all public servants have to declare annually their interest in investments and properties. For ex-public servants, the Official Secrets Act already requires that they do not retain information once they leave service, and they are culpable too under the OSA if they commit any data-related offense in this bill. The provisions in the Protection of Secrecy Act remain valid and relevant for stat boards and prescribed government companies to abide by, and will be a complementary safeguard to this new bill. The second is to institutionalize our cybersecurity capability, and that is done through the CSA, Cybersecurity Agency, established on 1st April 15 to oversee a new national cybersecurity structure with a mandate to devise and coordinate national cybersecurity strategy and policy development, carry out both peacetime capability development and crisis management across all sectors, and finally adopt a holistic approach towards management of information infrastructure.
Mr. Ong, your time limit is almost up. One more minute.
I will do so. Third, internet serving separation. In May 2016, the government decided that devices connected to government network will no longer be able to access the internet in order to strengthen the government ICT system, and this was implemented in mid-2017. Fourth, adopt best practices. This is obvious. And 5, education, because the weakest link is always the human. We always need to educate every single officer how to do the right thing so that cybersecurity breaches are minimized. And this must include the reporting on malpractices, as mentioned by Ms. Cha Yong-yong. Mr. Deputy Speaker, I think I've answered most, if not all, the questions. I beg to move.